In part 4, we'll look at installing the servo and also creating the linkages and the front control arms that they attach to. These are probably easiest made by using two 100 millimeter M3 or 3 millimeter thick threaded rods. You just cut them in thirds, about 33 millimeters. You've got these various size of heads. This is for the servo linkage. Look in the PDF. One I think is 67.5, or two rather, are 67.5. And the two that aren't made are very easy to make. You just thread these into the rod, and I think they're 69 millimeters in length. But look at the PDF. The servo, fairly easy to install. You'll notice that there's these small mounting brackets that help to install the servo, and you just put them on the side just with one single screw. You have to put a ball on the servo arm. This was the servo arm. I think this is a metal aluminum servo arm that came with the servo, so I just put a small ball that's going to connect to one of those linkages. I used a 10 millimeter long M3 just flathead screw that I had. I had to drill this out with both a 2 millimeter drill and then a 2.5 millimeter drill so this wouldn't split. It's a fairly small ball. And once you install this on the back, this is how that short linkage is going to attach to the servo. So this shows the two support arms. This is a full-size servo. You can use a micro servo if you wish. I think that's strong enough. This is a 20 kilogram servo. There will be two 8 millimeter flathead screws that come up from the bottom and will secure this in. But I wouldn't recommend that you do that now, because when you install the drivetrain here, you're going to need to get at these bolts here. Now, I had a mistake in my last build. I had put this mount for the airfoil on top, and it's got to go underneath this X cross member, or else the battery doesn't have enough height to fit under. You can also see for the battery that I have two, I think they're 5 millimeter bullet type connectors, and they'll just fit under here and sort of come up here, and they'll eventually connect to my electronic speed controller here. They're both using Dean's T connectors, but I think I've ordered some 5 millimeter bullet connectors, and I think I'll probably be making some custom cable with a T on it so I don't have to go under here, and that I can just connect very easily here. So now let's look at the control arms and how they're assembled. So these are two detailed pictures of how that is, and then we'll look at our assembly video here. So before we start, this just shows how this should go right in through here with the X cross member on top and the support arm underneath. This is a working control arm of one side, and I've even used the anti-roll bar. I think I'll install that, see how that goes. And what I use for the anti-roll bar, I just went to a dollar store and got an old whisk. I measured various size whisks, so I would get about between 1.2 and 1.6 millimeter steel wire, and just cut out the whisk metal lengths, and they worked fine. So this is the drive shaft. And you'll notice the nut spinning on the side. That's going to drive the front wheel. This is the steering arm that'll connect to your servo, and that will connect to your shock. Now, when you buy those drive shafts, you have to modify them slightly. We'll talk about that in a sec. That's going to connect into your belt drive in through the side piece there with the hole. It's going to go through there, and we won't install that till we've gotten our belt and shown the whole belt drivetrain and installed it into our chassis. So here's the other drivetrain, and what I've done is I've just cut, I think, 8 millimeters off the end of it with a Dremel tool. It's a fairly soft metal, and then with a flat file you would just file another 8 millimeters of length. So 8 millimeters cut off, file another 8 millimeters up towards the threaded rod. And then you'll just put the cap back on, and it's got 2 grub screws that you can just tighten, and it's adjustable, so you can make that fit exactly the way you want it when you are doing the final installation. Okay, let's install the control arm. This is the top piece that has a steering arm in it. Now I had to drill out some of the holes in this piece. I'm using a 2 millimeter drill there. It'll be obvious in a second why. I want to make sure those are the right size. Make sure you look at the drawings to get the right parts, put them together in the right orientation. Now there's 2 bearings that go in each part. The 10 by 15 by 4, the larger bearing goes on the inside. It has the steering arm. You'll find there's a very small little spacer that also will go inside, but you can't put that on at this point. And then we're going to put a medium-sized bearing, the 5 by 11 by 4 bearing on the outside. Now there's also a hex nut, and it's got a 2 millimeter small rod that goes in the middle. You should test fit that. You may have to ream that out just a little bit to make sure it fits in the nut. But that's going to go in your drive arm, or the drive shaft, and then that nut is going to press against it. So now we'll put the small bearings in the top and bottom of the piece with the steering arm. And we're going to use 2 screws to go through there, 2 M3 8 millimeter screws to screw it to the other piece. Now you put the screw in the bottom first, because you're going to need to go through the top bearing with a Allen key. That's why we had to drill out the 2 millimeter hole to make sure we could get that Allen key through. And then once you put the bottom one in, the top one's pretty easy. You can use a regular screwdriver for that. And that binds those 2 pieces together. Now we use that spacer, that small blue spacer, and you're going to put that through the inside of the 2 larger bearings. And you really need to push through so that hole is visible on the other side, that you can put that little bar through. And then that nut is going to shove, and make sure that bar shoves into the nut so that when the drive shaft turns, that hex nut is going to turn. Now we'll look at the lower part of the control arm. That is a 22 millimeter M3 bar, and it's got to go through there, so I'm drilling that out with 3 millimeter drill bit. And that's going to go through the piece that we've just assembled. And you'll notice when that goes in, it actually goes down about 2 millimeters below the surface, so that it can be secured with a very small 4 millimeter M2 screw. So the head of the screw is actually going to come over and keep that bar from moving out. Now we'll install two small balls for the link arms. These will be secured by M2 12mm screws, so we're going to drill that out with a 2mm bit. There'll be two balls that we'll put on this piece. Now finally we're going to look at putting the shock ball on the lower control arm, and that'll be secured with a 12mm grub screw. Now I found I damaged a couple of these by grabbing them with pliers, so I just put a rubber band around them first and then grabbed them with the pliers, and that seemed to not only secure them better but didn't leave a big gouge in the ball. So now I'm installing the grub screw right through the ball, so it sticks out about halfway, and then I'm putting that screw into the lower control arm. We're now going to look at installing the support for the anti-sway bar, and there are two little blue balls that need to be installed here. And you'll notice that the sway bar will go into one of them. The other one will go into the bottom of that control arm. Now, the dimensions are given in the PDF, but one dimension that's not given is how far down that little bend goes, and it can't be much more than 4 or 5 millimeters, because that has to go inside there and then up, and if that droops down too far, it'll throw your arm height off. So it's going to be, this was a little difficult because I didn't have the right length of screw. You need about a 20mm M2 screw here, and I only had a 16mm. So I first had to drill a 2mm hole in the first part so the screw would slide through, but then I need to countersink that, put the head in about 2 or 3mm. So now I'm drilling very carefully into that with a 3mm drill, and you want to make sure that you printed this part with 100% infill. You don't want to be getting rid of all the perimeters around the hole and cutting into the infill. So you're just going in very short distance to countersink that M2 screw. Make sure the flat part faces towards the screw head, the flat part of the balls. And that screw will screw into an inner wall and sort of through an inner wall, and that will secure that little piece. And you'll eventually use that steel shaft to attach into the belt drive. Finally, we're going to add the last shock ball. We use a 12mm grub screw as well, similar to what we did before. Put it to the inner hole, and then we can just show how the shocks are going to attach to the shock tower. And that's it. We're pretty well, at this point, ready for the drivetrain. That's really all that's left. So I'm waiting for two parts. One is the actual belt, and the other is a receiver for my transmitter, so that I can make all the parts work. Hopefully they'll be in a week and we can do a final assembly video.